as you learned in the announcements this morning, will be uploaded to YouTube. So that means if you don't want to be on YouTube, now is the time to turn off your camera. The recording will run through my presentation and also through the congregational response. Following the congregational response, the recording will stop for the closing words. So take a moment and don't leave the meeting, please. We want you to stay, but if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera now.
There should be an option in the bottom left that says stop video if you don't wish to be recorded.
Thucydides' trap. Well, since we last met, we've had a few birthdays in my household. My oldest son recently turned 21, and my first daughter, she just turned 18. A few weeks after my son's 21st birthday on a cold Saturday morning in January, we were out in a parking lot somewhere in Norristown, Pennsylvania, for his driving exam. Well, he passed, and in celebration that evening, he and his siblings bought barbecue takeout from a restaurant a few miles away. My son volunteered to drive and pick it up, and his four siblings, up for a new adventure, piled into our blue Nissan Leaf, which seats maximum 5, including the driver. I remember my parting words as my son left the house with the car keys. Be careful, you have precious cargo. And off they drove. They left me home alone for about an hour. An experience I haven't had since I can't remember when. Being home alone in my household is a rare experience. A few what-if thoughts came through my mind, you know, the kind worst-case accident scenarios, but I didn't entertain them. I let them pass. Instead, I used the time to reflect on the new dynamic that was unfolding in my family system, in my life. Before my oldest got his license, I would have been the one behind the wheel in that role, the driver. But in this moment, he was rising to greater responsibility. In a sense, at least in this moment, replacing me. And there I was, home alone, no room for me in the vehicle that had once been under my control. My son's rise to new roles and responsibilities in the family has disrupted, in ways, the status quo, created some disequilibrium for me, and I found myself needing to adapt to changing conditions. On the one hand, I felt glad that there was now another adult who could help schlep my kids around. On the other hand, I felt something in me was being challenged, threatened even. My role, my even identity was in question. So mixed in with the gladness was some grief, a sadness, a sense of loss of a role that I have long held and valued. I even noticed myself wondering, where do I fit in now? Where do I belong? Well, what I've described here is the dynamic that unfolds in multiple contexts, creating structural stress and conflict with one of possibly two different outcomes. The first I'll call adaptive. That's where the ruling power, those in that position of status quo, face the threat of that rising power. The ruling power faces the evidence and wrestles with the necessary adjustments each side must make, and through nonviolent conflict resolution, and there's healthy adaptation. Now, there's another outcome that's possible, and that I would call maladaptive. Facing the threat of a rising power, the ruling power denies or avoids the evidence and avoids the work involved in making the necessary adjustments, and even does everything to retain that position, including isolating or containing, diminishing, and even sabotaging that rising power, leading to violent conflict, interpersonal violence, intergroup violence, international violence. Now, consider the scenario with my son becoming an adult. I could have refused to accept the conditions. I could have done everything to retain my old status and role. I could have taken actions to isolate him from the family. I could have denied him the car keys and even destroyed his birth certificates and other identifying documents, making it more difficult for him to get his license. Or I could have tried to diminish him by refusing to accept him as a legal adult, or even once he got the license, refusing to accept the legitimacy of that driver's license. A step further, I could have even gone so far as to divide my family, telling my children that my son's a poor driver and insist that they only ride with me. Taken to the extreme, I could even sabotage by paying someone to cause an accident. Now, it sounds absurd, I know, and I didn't go down that road. I really didn't. But what I've described are all very real human behaviors when faced with the dynamic that I'm describing. This dynamic, the structural stress created when a rising power threatens a ruling power, has a name: Thucydides' trap. We see it in family systems. We see it in congregations. A new member joins the community, or a minister is called, assumes new roles and responsibility, rises to positions of leadership and power, disrupting the status quo, creating disequilibrium, challenging those who had long held those roles, those positions of leadership and power, to adapt to changing conditions. We see it within nations. One administration is in power. A new administration, a rising power, threatens to replace the ruling power, creating disequilibrium in society, evoking fear in some and gratification in others. Such conditions challenge people to adapt. Sometimes the ruling power concedes and relinquishes power, roles, and responsibilities to a rising power. Sometimes the ruling power refuses to concede, refuses to accept conditions for what they are, and conflicts arise. Violence erupts. We see it between the nations of the world. We see it in history. A careful review of the past 500 years reveals 16 occasions when a rising power threatens a ruling power. And in 12 of those occasions, 3 out of 4, that's 75%, 75% of the time, the outcome is war. And today, we see this dynamic unfolding in relations between the United States and China. As a rapidly ascending China challenges the United States, accustomed to predominance, these two nations risk falling into a deadly trap, first identified by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who wrote about the devastating Peloponnesian War. This dynamic has been studied and written about by Graham Allison, who was the former dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, in his book called Destined for War: Can the United States and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Thucydides famously wrote in his study of the Peloponnesian War, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that that instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. And it's this perilous historical pattern when a rising power threatens a ruling power in a family system, in a congregational system, in a nation, between nations. This dynamic is the Thucydides trap. Let me show you the cases by sharing Graham Allison's website from the Belfer Center at Harvard. I'll put this link into the chat box. I'm showing a case file graphic of the 16 occasions over the last 500 years where a rising power threatened the ruling power. 12 of the 16 cases studied by Allison's Belfer Center at Harvard resulted in armed conflict and war. And now I'll just share some of the things that I studied and learned about during my study leave. What's going on? What's the elephant in the room in global affairs? This is a China quiz that Allison gives or has given to his students in the national security course at Harvard. China is a percentage of the United States, 1980 to 2015. Here are the answers. And his second quiz, when did China become #1 in all of these areas? And here are the results. It's all unfolded in the last 15 years. I find this astonishing. And one more image from Allison's study at Harvard. Who's rebalancing whom in terms of GDP? These charts reveal the impact of a rising China on the United States and global order. Writing in 2015 in The Atlantic, Allison says the Thucydides trap is the best lens for understanding current relations between the United States and China. He says that China and the United States are on a collision course for war. He asks whether war is inevitable, but he offers hope. He says war is not inevitable. He's not a fatalist or a pessimist, but he acknowledges what he calls the tectonic structural stress each side must master to construct a peaceful relationship. Allison writes, if Hollywood were making a movie pitting China against the United States on the path to war, central casting could not find two better leading actors than Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Both want to make their countries great again. Since the change in administration, I feel some relief. But the Thucydides trap is still a trap that we need to pay attention to. We are a religious community that covenants to affirm and promote acceptance of one another, the use of the democratic process, the goal of world community, and respect for the interdependent web of existence. These are universal aspirations that we hold for ourselves and for all people. How do we reconcile these universal aspirations with the rise of China? China is a socialist state, not democratic. China values the collective good over the rights of conscience, over individual rights and liberties. And this fact, amid pandemic, enabled China to ride out this year with fewer than 10,000 lives lost, as far as we know, and continuous economic growth, while we in the United States stagger along as we approach 500,000 dead. Can we, the people of the United States, beat the odds of history? Can we accept China as a rising economic power that will inevitably surpass the United States? Can we adapt to a new global economic order where China rules and the US is number two, where the very universal aspirations we covenant to affirm and promote as a religious community are challenged by this new rising power? In short, will we find a way to avoid war, as Britain and the United States did a century ago when the United States was the rising power and Britain was the ruling power threatened by US rise? Or do we avoid war as the way the United States and the Soviet Union did during 4 decades of Cold War? These are two of the 4 examples in history where nations faced the Thucydides trap and were able to avoid war. Or will US citizens allow our nation to fall into the Thucydides trap? I don't want the United States to go to war with China. The prospect seems unthinkable, but given the historical evidence, war is all too probable. Writing in 2018, Allison says the dynamic will intensify in the years ahead. He says denying the Thucydides trap does not make it less real. Recognizing it does not mean just accepting whatever happens. He says we owe it to future generations to face one of history's most brutal tendencies head on and to do everything we can to defy the odds. At this point, I'll pause and open it up to the congregation for response time.
Hi, Chris. This is Rose O'Neill. I've got a comment. Remember, this is modern times. War does not mean nuclear weapons. War can mean an attack on the economy, on the internet, on sending germs. Not that that happened, but so just be aware of that, it could be war, but maybe not a traditional one or an attack. That's all. John or Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the theses that you have relayed from Allison is not without value. However, before I became an engineer, I got a bachelor's in history. Before that, I had read the Peloponnesian War, and I had read it twice since. And it's mischaracterizing the lessons from his book. The main lesson he was trying to convey is that both the leaders of Athens and Sparta were led to war because they only saw a small portion of reality. They didn't see the big picture. They were focused on specific issues. And if they had a greater awareness or saw a greater awareness of the effects of their actions, that they could have avoided war, and that the limitations of their intellectual scope is what made the war. A second theme of his was that history is so complex that you cannot formalistically predict what's going to happen or use specific instances to predict what's going to happen, and that anybody who looks at the past to predict how people will behave in the future is delusional. So that's what I got out of my reading of Thucydides.
Thank you, Patrick. Anybody else? Jay Beaumont's got his hand up.
Hello. Two things. First of all, looking at the numbers from an engineer's point of view, I note that China has 4 times as many people as the United States, which, you know, probably a giant army compared to that. But so the per capita value of all those numbers actually puts them below the United States, just because, you know, we have, they have so many more people, but they don't have 4 times as much internet connection and all those other things. Second thing is that these days, I guess with globalization, the economies of our countries, despite Trump and Xi Jinping, are very intertwined. The Apples of the world, I'm sure, would be very mad at Donald Trump for cutting them off from Foxconn to make their phones and whatever. Also, the farmers of the United States took a terrible beating when Trump did the tariffs, and the Chinese came back with tariffs on soybeans. Basically, they lost a huge chunk of their money market, and that forced Trump to come back and basically pay the farmers what they lost. So that's a lesson. Hopefully, that Biden and the rest of the leaders will say, "Boy, that was a stupid move." And so the economic forces will be, I think, a drag on any kind of war forces.
Great point. Hollis, go ahead.
Reverend Chris, one of the things I wish you had brought out about Thucydides, I can't get it quite right, is that he was one of the very first philosophers to deal with real politics, to talk about world events and powers and things happening without relating it to the gods. And what he represented in doing that is a force against fake news, propagandists, people that seek to stir up anonymity between nations with lies, people in high positions of power who are lying liars and who feel the end justifies the means in a Machiavellian way. So that was one thing that that philosopher needs to be put on a pedestal for.
All right, we're looking for more hands. I'm going to go to page 2. Go ahead, Mike. You're muted.
Yes, well, thank you for that enlightening sermon, sir. And it seems to me that the one conclusion that Thucydides never drew was, if they had cooperated rather than fought a 30 years war, and they were so evenly matched on the battlefield that it was really pointless of them to have a war if they had had some diplomatic genius rather than these war guys. Athens and Sparta could have concluded quite nicely and created the country of Greece centuries ahead of time. We have the same opportunity with Russia, and we are well on our way in many ways to cooperate rather than fight. And I think it will occur to certainly the business people first that cooperation is a better idea.
Great point, Mike. Donna Deming?
Well, I wanted to point out an interesting article in the business section of the Times today. It's called How the United States is Losing the Cyber War. It's pretty eye-opening of how we've always been kind of on the offense and think we know it all. We left open that big hole in Microsoft, and how like our data has been taken now for quite a few years. So we really aren't winning the cyber war, but we are being attacked quite a bit. Very enlightening article.
Thank you, Donna. Peter? You're still muted, Peter. Still. Peter, you've got to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
However, in the vegetable garden, you have one plant and your next one is compete with another plant, and the root will grow different. I found recently with a scientific article say that particular plant will create some kind of cooperative solution rather than I get as much as I can have, not to share with your neighbor, not to share with a competitor. That we call it cooperative solution. So I think we should think in that way to work with China to make some kind of, cooperative effort to work together. That's my first point is so-called cooperative solution rather than competition. Another point I want to say with the Chinese people, young people in China, they have exposed to internet, you name it. In their mind, they are not the same old folks like Donald Trump. They are not interested in war in general as a young people nowadays, because they have been exposed to all the Western media, internet, you name it. So in general term, I will say the second generation, the young people around the world are much better in the mode to work together rather than against each other. But our old generation may be still very traditional. I am American, you are Chinese. That kind of separation idea. But the young generation nowadays is very broad. They don't really think very much independent. You are a Chinese, I'm American, you are Spanish. Those kind of individual idea is not that popular anymore. So I think we can avoid the war between mainland China and the United States because the young generation don't accept that kind of idea.
I like
my personal
the way you think.
That's what I believe.
Okay, I'll just checking for some more hands. I'll go over to page 2. Jay, do you want to say something else?
Something just occurred to me that inside the United States, we may have the makings of a internal Peloponnesian War, just judging from January 6th and kind of the white supremacist reaction to the equalization of the country. Just a thought.
It's a good point. Chris, do you want to wrap it up with a few remarks?
Well, I'm concerned that I didn't hear half of what Peter had to say, and I don't think anyone else did, Peter, because we didn't hear you for the first 30 seconds.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought should be a so-called a cooperative solution between those two countries, rather than direct independent competition. It's not the solution, because I give example as I grow vegetable in my garden. I found this is also proved by scientific report. Say a plant by himself, they can grow their root very well. But when the neighbor, another plant next to him, then they have under competition. But however, in general term, even you have another plant next to you, both of them are doing well. Not necessarily one do well, another one.
I see you use service.
That is not in reality, in the nature environment. I think we should learn from the plant. We should learn from the nature. Nature is under competition. At the same time, nature is also under cooperative solution to survive, in a community, rather than only one plant will do well, another plant is not going to do well, which is not true in nature. Okay?
Before someone else speaks, I think Vern is with us and she's trying to say something to us over the phone. So Vern, would you like to share?
*6, Vern.
No.
I can hear you.
Hello, Vern.
No, I don't want to say anything.
Okay, well, we're glad to hear your voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just appreciate the engagement with the topic, and of course, conversations about the United States and China are important, but also more reflecting on this dynamic and how it plays out in our own lives. And conversations about power within a religious community are often, we don't have them, but we need to, because power is part of life and organizational systems. And cooperative power, as Peter said, is certainly what we aspire for in Unitarian Universalism. It has played out in our congregation as a conversation around shared ministry. It's in my call to be your minister that we do shared ministry, that in the office of ministry, I have power. I have a certain amount of power. And it creates a dynamic within congregational systems. And how is that power managed? How is it shared? How does the congregation cooperate or not cooperate with that power? And so I would hope that while conversations about China and the United States are important, but we also reflect on this dynamic and how it may or may not be playing out within our own community.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to stop the recording now.